It's hard for us now to think that the young John Gielgud could have been seen as anything other than a potential actor as a boy. When he was growing up in the early years of this century, he was surrounded by his famous relatives, the Terrys, and from an early age the theatre exerted a magnetic pull.
I was tremendously englamoured by it because my family were so connected with the theatre, and I had great aunts and great uncles who were all famous actors who used to come and see us at Christmas time. And my parents were not altogether enthusiastic about the theatre. My mother loved it and talked about it a certain amount. My father also loved it, but was not very keen on it on the kind of gossipy side of the theatre. He was a more serious man and in a way more intellectual than my mother. He liked music very much. He used to take us to concerts in the very hard seats in the Albert Hall behind the organ. And I heard some wonderful concerts in those days which gave me an appetite for music. And he also took us to museums, which rather bored us, but I'm glad now, and picture galleries. And so one way and another, I and my two brothers and my younger sister, were all rather intelligently brought up. We were not encouraged to play games because my parents didn't play any games, and they didn't swim, and they didn't ride, and they didn't shoot, and they didn't fish. So we used to go for holidays to seaside places and to country places at Easter and in the summer. We had 3 or 4 servants, a nurse, a governess, though I don't think my father made more than 2,000 a year. But in those days, of course, that was possible. And I do remember very well all the London of my youth, the straw down outside the houses when people were ill, and the muffin man with his green baize apron and bell, and the coalmen who carried those big sacks of coal on their heads on kind of hoods, like Doolittle wears in Pygmalion, and put the coal down manholes in front of your house with a terrible noise, and huge great carts were bringing the coal with big horses. And the horse traffic, which made a fearful row, much more, I think, than the motors that came later. And everything was a kind of excitement and expedition to me. I went to a kindergarten, then a prep school in the country, then to Westminster as a resident King's Scholar, and then I was allowed to be a non-resident during the First War because of the Zeppelin raids, which I made the excuse because, of course, I wanted to come home for weekends, so they allowed me to. And I remember all that time extremely clearly, although it's such a long time ago. My father was a great walker. We used to walk to school. He used to take us sometimes. And long walks everywhere to see my relations in various parts of London. My grandmother lived in the far reaches of the Cromwell Road. And a very strange thing happened the other day. I was coming back from America, and I got into the car to drive from Heathrow, and as I passed the end of my grandmother's road, I saw her house being absolutely destroyed by the bulldozers, brick by brick. It's gone. It's not there anymore. And I could suddenly, of course, remember the look of every single room, and my aunt giving me biscuits in her bedroom, and my grandmother sitting up with a pigtail down her back, and the dining room and drawing room where we used to call and see her. And it was very peculiar. I found that to get old in London, one of the reasons I don't live there anymore is that I find it so nostalgic. Wherever I go, houses are pulled down, streets are changed, directions are different, and you hardly recognize the place as you knew it as a young man. Because I was greatly in love with London. I'd explored it on foot mainly, many, many times, also the city and Chelsea and Hammersmith. And I used to love all those places, and of course particularly the West End where the theatres were, which in those days was rather demure and polite. And there were the marquees and the queues of the pit and gallery doors and the photographs in front of the theatres.
But your first thought was to be a designer. What made you decide to become an actor?
I went to the theatre whenever I could and spent all my pocket money going there. And I was, of course, enraptured by the idea of Ellen Terry and Gordon Craig being so closely related. And I read all Craig's books, and I had a model theatre which I used to design scenery for and act plays in and so on with my brother and sister. And this went on and became a little more ambitious as time went on. And I thought I would love to design scenery because I had been so taken with all decorative art, and I did a lot of drawing in my spare time of imaginary costumes and illustrations and things like that. I remember copying out the whole of The Lady of Shalott and doing sort of illuminations of it. I've still got the copy. I gave it to my mother as a present. Of course, she was enraptured. It was a very amateurish effort, but it was a labour of love, and it took many months. And I loved doing that. So I had a whole portfolio of drawings, and I showed one or two of them very timidly to my Uncle Fred. talked about being a scene designer or decorator. And then after a few more inquiries, I discovered it would mean that I would have to learn architecture and blueprints and things, and I was hopeless at mathematics. So I thought, oh, that's no good. I shall never be able to be any good at that. And then I suppose I played a few sort of ridiculous amateur things. At my prep school, I played Mark Antony and Shylock, and I did some amateur work with Rosina Philippi, who was a very famous old actress who had a school in Chelsea, and I played Mercutio for her and some play of Rhoda Broughton's that had been dramatised for some matinees. And I played Orlando in an open-air performance in Battle Abbey. And I knew, of course, some of my school friends were mad on the theatre. So I said, well, what about my being an actor, not knowing whether I had any possible talent or not. And they rather kind of hemmed and hawed, my parents. And I said, well, supposing you let me go on the stage if I can get into one of the dramatic schools. And then if I haven't made a success by the time I'm 25, I'll do what you want and go to architecture and try and learn proper mathematics and architecture. Because I felt at that time I didn't want to go to Oxford, although I was mad about Oxford, which I had visited when my brothers were there. My eldest brother, Lewis, was at Magdalen, both before and after the First War, and my brother Val was at Trinity a little later. So I'd been to Oxford and been enraptured by the city, and rather longed to go there, but I felt in my last terms at Westminster that I wasn't getting very far. I was specialising in English literature, I think, and history, and I wasn't feeling I was much good at it. And I thought, well, it's rather a waste of time to spend these years reading, of course, that my grandmother and my aunts had all been in the theatre from their childhood. So I said, why don't I go on the stage straight away? And I was then 17. So they agreed rather reluctantly, and I went and I don't quite know how, I suppose I wrote in, but I went to Lady Benson's little school, which was close to my grandmother's house in Cromwell Road, and recited there, and got a scholarship, and spent a year there. And I played several important parts, including bits of Hamlet and Sir Peter Teazle and all sorts of things, because there were very few men in her school. There were about 20 girls, I think, and about 5 men, and so we used to split up the parts and play them at all the public shows. And I seemed to be getting on rather well there, although she thought me very mannered and rather effeminate, which I was, and very conceited, which I also was. So I was put in my place a little bit. She was an admirable teacher and a very sort of pungent, witty woman, not a good actress herself. She used to come and do the Ophelia Mad scene in a large Edwardian hat. And it's a great treat for us. We didn't know how to contain ourselves. It was so bad. But she'd not been a success as an actress, although she'd been Benson's leading lady for many years. But she'd then retired. Her marriage had been broken up, and she was running this little school with some success. So I had quite an interesting year there, made a few friends, and played some rather important parts, only little bits of them, of course, Benedict and Hamlet and so on. And then my cousin Phyllis Nielsen Terrier, who I hardly knew, except I'd been to see her in plays and been introduced to her in the dressing room, and I was greatly in awe of her because she was a beautiful, statuesque creature with very pale blue eyes, and a great star in those days. And she suddenly wrote out of the blue and asked me to go on tour with her as assistant stage manager, understudying, I think, 4 parts as well, at £4.10 a week. So I jumped at it, of course.